Look at those ugly scars, princess. What happened fell down some stairs. The recruit's cruel laughter echoed as he filmed the silent woman mocking every mark on her scarred arms. She stood frozen, saying nothing, while he humiliated her in front of everyone. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was something far more dangerous. When the general appeared, his face went white with rage. "You just mocked!" The words that followed made hardened soldiers drop to their knees, made the recruit's phone shatter on the ground. What call sign could terrify an entire army base BD Stories family? Comment below. Who do you think she really is? Nice bruises, princess? Didn't know Fort Blackwater had spa days? The voice sliced through the early morning haze like a dull blade cutting through the humid Tennessee air with deliberate cruelty. Private Jake Morrison smirked as he stepped back in line, his voice pitched just loud enough to ensure every soldier within 50 yards could hear his mockery. That was the point after all. Public humiliation always hit harder than private insults, and Jake Morrison had built his reputation on knowing exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Sergeant Maya Stanley stood alone on the open training field, her olive green tank top soaked through with sweat, despite the early hour dust clinging to her bronze skin, like a second uniform that refused to come clean. The morning sun caught the evidence of her recent struggles. Bruises bloomed across her arms in various shades of purple and yellow, spreading down her collarbone like some twisted artwork painted in pain. These weren't the kind of marks that came from one bad day or a single accident. These were the kind you earned slowly, the kind that lingered and told stories their bearer never wanted to share, the kind that whispered of battles fought in darkness where no one else could see. Her knuckles were raw and split the skin across them, telling tales of recent violence, and her gait carried just the slightest hitch, a barely perceptible favor of her left leg that spoke of old injuries never quite healed. But despite the physical evidence of whatever hell she'd been through, Maya's posture remained unshaken, her spine straight as a rifle barrel, her shoulders squared with the kind of discipline that couldn't be taught in basic training. Behind her, the assembled unit of Bravo Squad shifted restlessly, some chuckling quietly at Jake's crude joke, while others watched her with the detached amusement of spectators at a blood sport waiting to see if the new arrival would crumble under the pressure or fight back. She was new here, technically the only female soldier assigned to Bravo Squad in the last 2 years, a fact that had generated considerable speculation among the ranks. No formal introduction had been made, no backstory provided, no explanation given for her sudden appearance among their tight-knit brotherhood. All anyone knew was that she'd been transferred in on what the paperwork called special directive, military bureaucracy speak that could mean anything from disciplinary action to witness protection. The ambiguity had bred whispers that floated through the barracks like smoke, each theory more creative than the last. Some claimed she was recovering from combat injuries, pointing to the obvious physical evidence. Others insisted she was just a paper pusher trying to prove herself with real soldiers. A few suggested she was an undercover investigator. But Maya Stanley offered no clarification, no defense against the speculation, no acknowledgement of the whispered theories that followed her like shadows. "How many push-ups does it take to snap a wrist, Sarge?" Jake continued his assault, his lazy grin spreading wider as he warmed to his theme. "Or did you trip over your own ego again? Maybe took a tumble down the stairs at the Pentagon?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, and the nervous laughter that followed had the sharp edge of pack animals testing their prey. Jake Morrison had always possessed a particular talent for finding the exact words that would cut deepest, and he'd learned early that public ridicule was far more devastating than private confrontation. Maya didn't say a word in response to his taunts. She didn't flinch when the laughter rippled through the assembled soldiers, didn't even blink when Jake's voice rose another octave to ensure maximum audience participation. Her dark eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the training field, as if she were seeing something the rest of them couldn't perceive. That absolute stillness, that complete lack of reaction, bothered Jake more than he would ever admit to his fellow soldiers. He'd expected anger tears, or at least some defensive response that would validate his cruelty and provide entertainment for the crowd. None of them really knew her, and in the absence of truth, people inevitably became bold. They filled the vacuum of information with their own assumptions, their own prejudices, their own need to categorize and dismiss anything that challenged their understanding of how things should be. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that Maya Stanley hadn't asked to come back to active duty. She had volunteered for this assignment, not because she needed redemption or sought to prove anything to anyone, but because she carried debts that only she understood, responsibilities that weighed heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. From a small rise just beyond the training field's perimeter, General Victor Sterling stood watching the scene unfold with the patience of a man who had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by its cruelty. His weathered hands remained clasped behind his back, his expression as unreadable as carved stone, but his pale blue eyes missed nothing. He'd known the moment Maya stepped out of that dusty Humvee earlier that morning that this assignment wouldn't be easy for her. Maya Stanley had never sought attention or recognition, had never asked for special treatment or consideration. And yet wherever she went, history seemed to follow like a faithful dog, impossible to shake and impossible to ignore. Still, the general didn't intervene in the ugly scene playing out below. Not yet. Sometimes the best lessons came from allowing situations to develop naturally, from letting people reveal their true character without interference from authority. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't force respect or manufacture character. Both had to be earned through fire and proven through adversity. Maya Stanley had already proven herself in ways these young soldiers couldn't begin to imagine, but they would have to discover that truth for themselves. Maya stood in the rising heat of the Tennessee morning, silent and still as a monument, while the bruises along her neck, half healed, but still angry red at the edges, caught the strengthening sunlight. The thin scar beneath her left eye shimmered faintly, a pale line so precise it looked almost surgical, a mystery that would have solved many puzzles if anyone had bothered to ask the right questions. She didn't defend herself against Jake's verbal assault, didn't look away from whatever distant vision held her attention, because Maya Stanley knew something the rest of them had never learned. In their comfortable lives, respect earned in silence lasted longer than applause earned through noise. She looked like someone who had walked through hell and emerged carrying others on her back, and some of the assembled soldiers were already placing silent bets on whether she'd made it back intact, or was still trapped in whatever nightmare had carved those marks into her flesh. But Maya's stillness wasn't the paralysis of fear or the submission of defeat. It was something deeper, something older, something that came from places where noise meant death, and silence meant survival. Her shoulders remained squared despite the weight of invisible burdens, her breathing steady despite the emotional assault, her hands steady despite whatever memories Jake's cruelty might have triggered. The number 27 tattooed in small, precise digits on her left wrist caught the morning light for just a moment, barely visible beneath the sleeve of her tank top, but there for anyone who knew how to look. It was the kind of detail that might have explained everything if anyone had possessed the courage to ask. But courage was in short supply that morning among the soldiers of Bravo Squad. They preferred their mysteries unsolved, their assumptions unchallenged, their comfortable prejudices undisturbed by inconvenient truths. Jake Morrison's frustration grew with each passing second of Maya's silence. He'd expected to break her composure, to provoke some reaction that would justify his cruelty and entertain his audience. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who seemed as immovable as granite, as unresponsive as the desert, as dangerous as still water. Something about her absolute calm made him feel exposed, vulnerable, like he was the one being judged, rather than the one doing the judging. What secret was Maya hiding behind those scars? Type scars, if you think Maya's silence means she's hiding something dangerous. The next morning brought no relief from Jake Morrison's campaign of systematic humiliation. If anything, Maya's refusal to react to his initial assault had only inflamed his determination to break through her composure and find whatever weakness lay beneath that granite exterior. As the squad assembled for their morning exercises, Jake made his move with the calculated precision of a predator who had identified his prey's vulnerabilities. He carried a water bottle in his left hand, ostensibly for hydration during the upcoming training session, but his real intention became clear when he deliberately stumbled near Maya's position. "Oops, clumsy me," Jake announced with theatrical regret as the contents of his bottle splashed across Maya's gear, soaking her backpack and the spare uniform she'd laid out for inspection. "Guess I'm just as clumsy as you are, right, princess?" His voice carried that particular blend of false innocence and genuine malice that bullies had perfected throughout human history. The water darkened the fabric of her spare clothes and turned the dust on her equipment into mud, creating a mess that would take considerable time and effort to clean. Several soldiers snickered at the obvious setup, appreciating the creativity of Jake's latest torment. Maya's response was absolute silence. She didn't curse, didn't protest, didn't acknowledge anything had happened. She simply moved her damaged gear aside with methodical precision. During exercises, Jake continued obstructing her movements while maintaining the pretense of accidental clumsiness. "Get a good angle of those battle scars, princess," Jake muttered as he pulled out his smartphone, angling it to capture Maya's struggle with the obstacle course, while his deliberate interference made every task more difficult. "This is going to make great content for social media." His phone's camera focused on her face, trying to capture any sign of frustration or anger that he could later use to humiliate her further. The other soldiers watched this technological assault with varying degrees of discomfort, some laughing along with Jake's performance, while others began to shift uneasily at the escalating cruelty. But Maya Stanley's response continued to confound her tormentor. Her eyes showed something deeper than mere patience. They reflected the controlled discipline of someone who had learned to master their emotions under far more challenging circumstances than anything Jake Morrison could devise. During the physical exercises, she moved with a precision that spoke of extensive training, her form flawless despite Jake's constant interference. Other soldiers began to notice that her technique was superior to their own, that she performed every movement with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of intensive practice. When the morning session ended and the soldiers dispersed for their break, Maya retreated to her small quarters in the barracks. Alone in that sparse room, she stood before the mirror mounted on the wall, her reflection showing the full extent of the damage that recent events had inflicted on her body. She raised one hand to gently touch the thin scar beneath her left eye, that precise line that seemed almost surgical in its perfection. From the small table beside her bed, she picked up a set of dog tags that bore 26 names engraved in tiny, precise lettering. Names that meant nothing to anyone else but carried the weight of worlds for Maya Stanley. She had volunteered for this assignment, not because she needed redemption or sought to prove anything to the world, but because she carried unfinished business that could only be resolved through service to others. The photograph on her table showed 26 young faces, all wearing military uniforms, all smiling with the confidence of youth and the certainty of purpose. They had trusted her, once followed her leadership, and believed in her ability to bring them home safely. That trust had been betrayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control, but the weight of that failure remained carved into her soul, like those scars were carved into her flesh. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the barracks, whispered conversations were taking place that would have changed everything if Maya had been able to hear them. Two older soldiers, veterans of multiple deployments, who had seen enough of military life to recognize certain signs, spoke in hushed tones during their afternoon break. "Don't mess with her," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez warned his companion, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "You heard about the Ghost Line mission, right? That operation that went sideways about 4 years ago. The only one who made it back," Staff Sergeant Williams replied, his own voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Command said she needed special attention, special handling, something about psychological evaluation and fitness for duty reviews." The two men exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge of classified information that couldn't be discussed openly but carried implications that made both of them nervous. "That name they whisper sometimes, Widow 27. I heard it mentioned in meetings with the brass. Stories passed around like legends during night shifts." Jake Morrison's frustration continued to mount as his campaign of psychological warfare failed to produce the desired results. "When people don't know the truth, they become bold," he muttered to his closest supporters, his voice carrying the bitter edge of someone whose assumptions about the world were being challenged. He tried increasingly desperate tactics to break through Maya's composure, his insults becoming more personal and his interference more obvious. "Nice collection of scars," he taunted during one particularly intense training session. "Each one tells a story, or just proof you're clumsy." Maya's only response was a slight tightening of her jaw, a barely perceptible clenching of her hands behind her back. But even these minimal reactions were enough to fuel Jake's determination to find whatever psychological button would finally break through her defenses. He began to sense that there was more to Maya Stanley than the broken soldier he'd initially assumed her to be, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down from the confrontation he'd initiated. Instead, he doubled down on his cruelty, convinced that persistence would eventually reveal her weaknesses. The mystery surrounding Maya continued to deepen as more soldiers began to notice details that didn't fit their initial assumptions. A veteran instructor made a point of avoiding eye contact with her during training sessions, not because he didn't respect her, but because he respected her too much to risk the complications that recognition might bring. Maya's walk carried that slight unevenness that spoke of old injuries, but her movements during combat training were fluid and precise, suggesting someone with extensive experience in dangerous situations. The number 27 tattooed on her wrist became more noticeable as other soldiers began to pay closer attention to details they'd previously overlooked. Some began to wonder if those digits might have significance beyond mere personal preference, if they might represent something more meaningful than simple decoration. But Maya offered no explanations, no clarifications, no acknowledgement that she even noticed their increased scrutiny. She remained as silent and mysterious as she'd been from the moment of her arrival. Jake Morrison's campaign of harassment reached a crescendo as he began planning what he called the ultimate test, a public humiliation that would finally break through Maya's psychological defenses and expose whatever weakness lay beneath her composed exterior. "Tomorrow we find out what our war hero is really made of," he announced to his supporters, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "She's been hiding behind that silent act long enough. Time to see if there's actually anything underneath all that mysterious bullshit." He spent the evening preparing for what he envisioned as the final confrontation, setting up his phone for live streaming and recruiting other soldiers to serve as his audience.